Hanukkah Sameach, or Happy Hanukkah. Tonight is the first night of the Festival of Lights 2020. I've got my yarmulke, I've got my Hanukkah, my menorah, as we tend to call it in English, and I am ready for solemnity. Just kidding. Hanukkah is a solemn festival, but it's also a joyous festival. And there are a few things that bring me greater joy in the Hanukkah season than Eric Kimmel's children's book, Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So, Herschel of Ostapol, or Herschel Ostapoler, is one of the great trickster figures of Jewish history. He is a poor Jew from the shtetl, from what's now Ukraine, and he tricks people. He tricks, in this case, goblins. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But Herschel tricks the wealthy. He tricks the powerful on behalf of the poor, the downtrodden, the oppressed. And so he's a great sort of egalitarian trickster figure, as we have in so many cultures. American Indians, Native Americans, First Nations Canadian, African and Afro-Caribbean, these different trickster figures from around the world who embody these ideals of equality, fairness, social justice, support for the little person, etc., etc. And so Eric Kimmel takes this figure and puts him into a Hanukkah story in Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins. And it's a moral tale. It's a significant sort of exploration of morality and faith. So essentially what happens is that Herschel comes to a town on the first night of Hanukkah, and no one is celebrating. It's a Jewish town, a shtetl, in Eastern Europe, sort of late 1800s, and no one is celebrating the festival. Herschel is traveling. He's poor again, and he decides that he wants to. He's going to try and beg a room, basically, from someone for the festival. And the townspeople tell him that they're not allowed to celebrate Hanukkah because the goblins have forbidden it. So the synagogue is closed. There are no candles, no Hanukkah are being lit. No one is playing dreidel. None of the traditional things, no blessings are being said. None of the traditional things that one does on Hanukkah. And so Herschel decides that he's going to take matters into his own hands. So he goes up to the synagogue. He goes to the temple. And he goes in and takes his Hanukkah. He lights the first night's candles. And a goblin appears. And basically the story is Herschel does this over and over and over for all of the nights of Hanukkah. And goblins keep appearing, and he tricks them. He doesn't defeat them by force. He doesn't defeat them by superior power or whatever it is. He defeats them through cunning. He defeats them through recognizing their sinful natures and using that against them. It's a bit like judo, right? Where you throw your opponent based on their own momentum or something like this. This is essentially what Herschel does. So for instance, one of the goblins is gluttonous. And these are largely sort of based on the 7 deadly sins type sins. So one of the goblins is gluttonous, and so Herschel feeds him a pickle. And another pickle. And the goblin wants all of the pickles, And so he reaches his claw into the jar of pickles and grabs a handful, and he's unable to pull his claw out of the jar. And the goblin accuses Herschel of having enchanted the jar to trap his hand. And Herschel says, yes, you have to sit there and watch while I light the Hanukkah candles for tonight. Only then will I tell you the secret of releasing your hand. And of course, the secret is simply to let go of all of the pickles. The reason the goblin can't pull his claw out of the jar is because he's trying to take too many pickles at once. But because he represents the sin of gluttony, he was unable to see that if he had released the pickles, and even just taken one at a time, he would have been able to get out of Herschel's trap. We have the same thing where Herschel tricks another goblin who's greedy for money, who's miserly. Herschel basically capitalizes on this goblin's love of gambling, and he makes up his own rules for dreidel, wherein no matter how the dreidel falls, the goblin loses money. And the goblin becomes infuriated by this. And again, through this series of tricks, Herschel is able to outsmart the goblins each night to light the Hanukkah candles. But on the last night of Hanukkah, the Goblin King arrives. So we've had these sort of moral tales about overcoming sinful desires for food, for money, whatever it is. The Goblin King represents something different. He represents a fundamental challenge to God, a fundamental challenge to Yahweh, the Almighty. And it's in this moment that Herschel faces his greatest test. This is the test of his faith. And essentially, Herschel has to trick the Goblin King into lighting the Hanukkah candles in order to break his power over the festival. And so the way that Herschel does this is really significant. He waits in the darkness for the Goblin King, and when the Goblin King arrives, he is a terrifying figure. He blows the doors off of the synagogue, and he confronts Herschel in the dark. And Herschel, who's terrified, pretends that he doesn't know who the Goblin King is. He accuses him of being some local boys playing a prank. And in order for the Goblin King to prove himself, Herschel says, "There's some candles on the table there. Why don't you light them?" And in this way, Herschel tricks the Goblin King into lighting Hanukkah candles, thereby breaking his power over Hanukkah. The Goblin King is infuriated. He destroys the synagogue. There's a great sort of whirlwind, and Herschel is terrified. But he sits calmly at the table where the candles remain lit. As the Goblin King disappears, as his power is broken, the synagogue is destroyed. But on the table, the Hanukkah, the menorah, the candles don't even flicker. And so this is the test of Herschel's faith. His faith is rewarded here because Hanukkah, the festival of lights, this joyous occasion, the celebration of God's miracle, is returned to the town. And the thing one of the things that's really noteworthy here is that we have even sort of recreation of the Hanukkah miracle itself, because the original miracle, when the Maccabees were fighting for Israel's freedom, they had enough oil for one day, and the lamps burned for 7 because God made a miracle for them. In the candles remaining alight on the table, as the Goblin King sends a whirlwind to destroy this synagogue, we have the repetition of that miracle, with the repetition of the light that remains lit as a symbol of God's favor.